Right, we're going to talk about the most important model you can find in business and management. Porter's five-force model, super important. Michael Porter wrote it in 1980, and it's very much in use today. Why is it important? Well, basically, it tells you the level of competition in your industry and therefore the level of profit that you're likely to make from your company in the future. So this model is very likely that you'll want to use this when you write your business plan, decide to start a new company, new venture, possibly buy another company. It's just very important and very useful. So we'll go through Porter's five-force model, explain it, and then towards the end, we'll have a live example. We'll have a look at the airline industry and the investment banking industry and try and work out the degree of competition in those two industries. So here we are. We've got the picture. We have the 5 different forces here. The first one we have here is suppliers. And what Michael Porter said is if you have, for example, only 1 or 2 suppliers, you may have a competition problem because they may decide to charge very high prices and therefore your profit margin will be quite low because you really have no choice. You have to use those 2 suppliers. Similar thing with customers. So we may only have 1 or 2 customers, and those customers then may say to you, well, I would like a very low price. And you don't really have a lot of choice then. You have to really accept what they say. You're charging a very low price, so you're maybe just covering your cost, and therefore your profit margin is very small. So these are 2 very potent sources of competition that we need to be aware of. This one here is the traditional one. So rivals, etc., we all know that they're a source of competition. If you have a lot of other companies fighting with you and competing, we're very likely to have very low margins. So I think that's a fairly obvious one. And then number 4, we have substitutes. So let's try and think about substitutes. What do we actually mean here? So for example, if you're going to travel from maybe Edinburgh to London, for example, you have various ways of doing that. You could go on the train. You could go on the train. You could go by car. You could go by perhaps bus. And even I think you could also fly potentially, so you could fly. So let's see, even if you're running a bus company, you do actually have competition from an airline, you have competition from the train company, you have competition from a taxi company. All these industries may not feel like they're competing, but they are actually in competition with each other. And then we've got the final one. Even if we have low competition today, in the future, we may have new competitors coming into the industry and then reducing profits. So let's have a talk about the new competitors and see how they're impacting us. Right, let's rub this out a minute and then I can write on this slide a minute. Now, new competition. They could come from, we need to really think about barriers to entry here. So let's try and write that in. If we have high barriers, we can avoid having new competitors. If we have low barriers, we may have a lot of new competitors. So what are these barriers to entry? Well, we could have, for example, a legal barrier. That would be something like a patent if we're running a drugs company. So we've got a legal barrier. So that would be a useful barrier. We could have a barrier for capital. For example, it's very difficult to set up a bank because you need a lot of capital to set up a bank. So I couldn't set up a bank tomorrow because I don't have that amount of money. You need to be really very well, well off financially to be able to do something like that. So that would be a very strong barrier for some industries. And then finally, we have something called brands, brand value. So we have a brand. Now, maybe the most famous brand in the world is someone called Coca-Cola. So we all know that brand. If you're going to set up as a soft drinks manufacturer, you have to compete with maybe Coca-Cola, and they have a very well-respected brand. So you can't really reduce that barrier to competition. So Coca-Cola are very safe. They can make very large profits because of their barrier to entry at the end of the day. Oh, hi, Alex.
Hi, I have a question.
Right.
Theoretically, so what would be the most important force of the five?
Okay. That's a good question, isn't it? So out of the five, what's the most important? Well, I would say it depends on what industry you're in. So it could be any of these five. So you really need to do your homework and think very strongly about the industry you're in. Which ones are the most important out of it? It really could be any of these. I think generally most people think it's this one. And in my opinion, it's not necessarily that one. It could be a balance of the other ones. So you really need to think. There's no obvious strongest force here. So let's have a look at these five forces in a bit more detail so we get a bit more knowledge about this. Try and do this. Okay, the board's working. Right, so we have the five forces here, and let's have a think about this. So we have suppliers. If we have very few suppliers, we may have very high cost. If we have very few customers, we may have low revenue. Reason being, they may say to you, well, look, I would like to just have a very low invoice, a very low cost. And in that case, you can only charge a very low revenue. So that affects your profit margin. And then we may have a lot of rivals. And that means our profit margin is probably very low. We may have a lot of substitutes. And that means the demand for our product is very low. And therefore, again, it affects our profits. And then finally, we have the new entrants. And again, that affects our profit margins. So we're really under attack here from all five of these. And all five of these potentially mean we have low profits. But all five could also mean, if we don't have these five, could mean that we got the potential for very high profits. So it's not necessarily a bad situation. Right, let's have a look. We'll try and make this practical. We'll try and do two industries and see how this actually works now. We have an airline. And I've chosen Air China, for example. That's a very well-known airline. We have Goldman Sachs, which is a very well-known investment bank. So what we'll do, I'll talk with Alex and see basically whether the competition is high or low, and then we'll do a prediction on what we think the profits will be. So Air China, they have really, there's really only two suppliers for airlines. There's Boeing and there's Airbus. So what do you think, Alex? Would you have a lot of competition there? Is that a problem for an airline?
Yeah, that would be high competition.
Yeah, okay. So bad news, we have high competition here, or high problems here. Customers. Can customers go to different airlines? Is that going to be like a problem for an airline, perhaps?
Yeah, definitely. They'll go to the cheapest one.
Yeah, they'll go to the cheapest. So everyone goes on the internet and tries to get a cheap flight at the end of the day. Are there a lot of airlines potentially out there to choose from?
Too many.
Too many. So we got high again. So yeah, things are looking bad so far. So let's have a look at this. What about substitutes? So if I want to go to Paris, for example, for the weekend, I could fly. But is there any like alternatives?
You can take the train,
Train,
the coach,
Well, I could
taxi if you would want to. It'll cost you a lot of money, but
Well,
yeah,
yeah,
you
yeah.
could.
Well, I could take my car, couldn't I?
Yeah.
So I mean, who knows? So
Yeah,
I got
it's a little
choice.
different.
I got choice. So yeah, a lot of high competition here. What about new entrants? Do we think there's a possibility of having new airlines being created?
Yeah, definitely. There's always new airlines or train.
Yeah, there is. Now, last year I saw a video by Michael Porter explaining this model, and he was talking about the airline industry. And one of the strange things he said is that although the competition is extremely high in 4 areas here, he said what he never understood is why there's so many new airlines set up. And when I did this model, I must admit, I thought, why do we get new competition here? But yeah, it seems to be that we have new airlines every year, so we even have high competition from new entrants. So we've got a lot of high competition. So what is the profit margin in an airline industry?
Well, quite low.
Low, right? So that is bad. We have a bad situation here. So we have a lot of unhappy airline companies here looking at this. Right, let's try Goldman Sachs. They're a very well-known investment bank in America and around the world. They don't really make anything. They have staff that do work, if you like. So would you say the competition for staff is high or low? Do you reckon?
I'm not sure.
We're not sure on that one. Maybe medium?
Yeah, probably.
Let's do medium. What about customers? Is there a lot of customers out there? Are a lot of companies that need that service at the end of the day? Yeah, so there's a lot of customers they could have. What about competitors? Are there a lot of very well-known investment banks in the world?
Not really.
Not really. Not really. So 2008, when we had the financial crash, most of those banks went bust. Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns. There's really very few banks left now. So they have low competition. Substitutes. Now, if you want to have some investment banking done, I mean, is there anywhere else you can get it done?
Not really.
Not really. Things are looking good so far.
Yeah.
New entrants. Now, do you find or have you seen lots of new banks set up every year? Do you think it's a common thing?
Definitely not.
Not really. A lot of these banks are like 100 years old or 200 years old. So they're generally quite old, aren't they? So we have medium, low, 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 low. What is the likely profit margin for this bank?
High profit.
So they are super profitable, one of the most profitable companies in the world. And we can maybe see why that is the case. And airlines tend to be some of the worst companies in the world, tend to have the worst profits. And I think we can see why that is as well. Okay, great. Thank you, Alex.